Hey class, this is Mr. Clark. These are the video lecture notes for History 17B, Chapter 29, Contesting Futures, America in the 1960s. Next slide. Here's a visual overview of the chapter. Next slide. The first section of the chapter is entitled The Kennedy Promise. The arrival of the Kennedys in the White House seemed to signal a new age of youth, optimism, and confidence. Next slide. Kennedy spoke of a, quote, new frontier, end quote, and this became the description that he used to describe his programs, the new frontier. Next slide. Kennedy promoted the expansion of programs to aid the poor, protected African Americans' right to vote, and improve African Americans' employment and educational opportunities. Next slide. For the most part, however, Kennedy focused on foreign policy and countering the threat of communism. This is a photograph of Kennedy speaking in Berlin when the Berlin Wall crisis was going on in the early 1960s. Next slide. He successfully diffused the Cuban Missile Crisis with the world on the verge of nuclear annihilation. Many historians believe this is the closest the world has ever come to a nuclear confrontation when the Soviet Union secretly tried to put nuclear weapons and missiles into Cuba. Next slide. In Vietnam, he sent advisors and troops to support the South Vietnamese government. South Vietnam was trying to maintain their independence in a civil war against the North, which was communist. Next slide. The tragedy of Kennedy's assassination in Dallas brought an early end to the era. This is one of the most famous photographs showing President Kennedy being hit. Next slide. The tragedy left Americans to wonder whether his vice president and successor, Lyndon Johnson, would bring Kennedy's vision for the nation to fruition. This is a photograph of Johnson being sworn in on Air Force One next to Mrs. Kennedy. Next slide. The next section is entitled Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. Lyndon Johnson began his administration with dreams of fulfilling his fallen predecessor's civil rights initiative and accomplishing his own plans to improve lives by eradicating poverty in the United States. Next slide. His social programs, investments in education, support for the arts, and commitment to civil rights changed the lives of countless people and transformed society in many ways. Next slide. Johnson's insistence on maintaining American commitments in Vietnam, a policy begun by his predecessors, hurt both his ability to realize his vision of the Great Society and his support among the American people. Next slide. The next segment of the chapter is entitled Civil Rights Movement Marches On. The African American civil rights movement made significant progress in the 1960s. Next slide. While Congress played a role by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the actions of civil rights groups such as CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were instrumental in forging new paths. Next slide. Civil rights activists engaged in sit-ins, freedom rides, and protest marches, and registered African American voters. Next slide. Despite the movement's many achievements, however, many grew frustrated with the slow pace of change. This is Malcolm X, one of those people that felt that way. Next slide. The failure of the Great Society to alleviate poverty and the persistence of violence against African Americans, particularly the tragic 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., created heightened tensions. Here's a photograph that was taken just seconds after the assassination of Dr. King. Next slide. Many African Americans in the mid to late 1960s adopted the ideology of Black Power, which promoted their work within their own communities to seek redress to problems without the aid of whites. Next slide. The Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, led largely by Cesar Chavez, also made significant progress at this time. Next slide. The emergence of the Chicano movement signaled Mexican Americans' determination to seize their political power, celebrate their cultural heritage, and demand their citizenship rights. Next slide. The last heading of the chapter is entitled Challenging the Status Quo. During the 1960s, many people rejected traditional roles and expectations. Next slide. Influenced and inspired by the civil rights movement, college students of the baby boomer generation and women of all ages began to fight to secure a stronger role in American society. Next slide. As members of groups like SDS, which stands for Students for a Democratic Society, and NOW, which stands for National Organization of Women, asserted their rights and strove for equality for themselves and others. They upended many accepted norms and set groundbreaking social and legal changes in motion. Next slide. Many of their successes continue to be felt today, while other goals remained unfulfilled. One of the unfulfilled goals was the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. Next slide. And that's it for Chapter 28.